All right. Well, once again, I'm here with Chelsea D'Souza, and we're going to talk about music. So this time, sort of the last, I guess, little part of this set. We are now in the sort of modern music era, and at this point, it's kind of like all bets are off. Like anything goes at this point in time now. Um, so especially today, for me, like I studied composition in school, and I was basically never told no about like things
Yeah.
about music. It's like nothing is wrong, right? Um, which I think is, I mean, good and bad in a way. For instance, like Debussy, his teachers were basically telling him that his music was bad, right? The music that Debussy was writing was bad music. And I firmly believe that had his teachers not been telling him that, Debussy would not have like continued to write the music that he wrote. Almost as a way to just like stick it to the man or something. Uh, and like I don't know, I feel like that is sort of this like tipping point between the romantic and modern eras of like in the romantic we basically stretch the rules as far as they can go, and then in the modern era it's like it just snaps and suddenly there are no more rules.
Yeah.
um
I think composers at the turn of the romantic into modern, which is like a very long period of transition, I feel like, compared to other periods. Like there's a
mhm,
lot of
mhm.
things sort of starting to happen in the first half of the 20th century. So it's very hard to pin down like all the threads, but there's definitely this sense of like, well, instead of changing the rules, we're just going to throw them out, you know?
Right. Because I feel like that with the end of the romantics, it like Wagner is kind of the end of this thing, right? And then they have the sort of the late romantics that are,
Yeah.
they're kind of like extending what Wagner was kind of doing here. Like harmonically speaking, it's like, what do you do after that? Especially it's like, this is the example I've brought up so far in every modern talk that I've had, but it's like, the ring cycle. You get 14 hours of opera, right?
Mhm.
And the entire time you don't even get like a tonic chord until the very end of the
Yeah.
thing.
Right.
And like you just you've essentially taken all of what came before it and just stretched it as far as it can possibly go. And you know I think what you're saying about instead of creating a new set of rules, they just throw everything away.
Mhm.
uh, and you know every time I get to this point in the class, I guess I start to show the music of this era to my students, and it's always surprising what they think of Debussy versus Schoenberg, for instance.
Mhm.
And so I show them Debussy's Sunken Cathedral, and then a set of Schoenberg piano etude or piano preludes,
Right.
and you know the class immediately gravitates, always, like 100% of the time they always gravitate towards Debussy, right? And
The
just to like,
pretty.
oh yeah, the pretty music, oh it sounds so nice, right? And what really interests me, I guess, about that is Debussy and Schoenberg, like theoretically, really weren't doing that much that was different, from each other. I mean, they essentially were both these atonal composers that are avoiding all semblance of like harmonic, like theory, avoiding tonality at all costs. And I feel like the difference between these two, though, is that Schoenberg was more of a classicist in the sense of like he really thought that the theme and the form of a piece of music was the most important part, whereas Debussy was more on the progressive side of these things. I feel like he was trying to push the the imagery of what a piece
Yeah.
of music could be.
Like if you compare it to what was going on in the art world during Debussy's time, it's impressionist,
Mm-hmm.
though he didn't, yeah, I don't know if he would have liked to be called impressionist, but I mean, I think of Debussy as such a like strong harmonic composer. Like everything is harmony related, but it's like you're taking the harmonies out of context. And that's
Yeah.
what like is makes it so intriguing as compared to the composers that came before him. What he did differently was like he took maybe the same chords or slightly more complicated chords than what had been used before, but he like took them out of the context and like removed the chords on either side and just placed them next to each other, and that created like a very different shimmery,
Yeah.
right? It's just like all of these images or sensations superimposed on top of each other. So
Right.
it's like all these pieces. Whereas by the time we get to Schoenberg, yes, and you know, it's funny that we think of Schoenberg as a modern or contemporary composer, but he was so bound to rules.
Right.
And
Right.
or at least the rules that he created for himself, the rules that he thought were important. So yes, this adherence to form was very important for Schoenberg.
So um, for you as a pianist, I imagine that like you've played plenty of Debussy in your life at this point. What do you think of his music? Just I mean, honestly, you as a pianist and a performer, what's it like for you to play a piece of Debussy? I guess.
Debussy was one of my earliest favorite composers. You know, if you like in my early teens, if you asked me who my favorite composer was, Debussy would definitely be up there, and he's still like a very favorite composer of mine. I think what drew me to Debussy was in order to play his music well, you have to use the piano in a very different way than other composers, and it allows you to explore these things that the piano can do in terms of like colors and using the resonance in different ways that you don't really get to do with other composers.
Yeah. So that makes sense though, because so for instance, on a technical aspect from like the composer's standpoint, I guess a lot of Debussy's music seems to be it's very blurred, kind of on purpose, and it seems that like that was one of my first sort of exercises in how to use the piano pedal, like as a composer, right? How do you use the pedal? And Debussy, that was always what like my teachers would say to look at like Debussy, and it's just like how does he phrase things, and that seems to be so much more important for him as this musician, I guess, is the colors that he gets out of this instrument, and how do you phrase that? I think it's really interesting. You say that you were sort of drawn to him like in your teens. Was it just because of the way the music sounded, or was it a particular experience, like a concert that you saw with this or something?
Actually, funny you should ask that because I do have a very, very strong. This was like, I think I was 14 or 15. And so, you know, I grew up in India, and I remember there was this like all India piano competition I did, and I learned a Debussy prelude. No, I learned one of the images. You know, there's two book of image, basically pictures, and the first one was called Reflections in the Water, and I really, really loved the piece. And I went to Germany that summer to take lessons with this piano teacher there, and she took me to a concert by this very famous pianist called Radu Lupu. So he is definitely like part of the old guard. He's getting up there in years, but like incredible pianist. And he played all like both books of the Debussy preludes in concert. Oh. And I just loved that. I mean, it was so beautiful and such an experience to sit in a concert hall and experience those colors, right? Because maybe more than other pieces, I feel like the acoustics of the space in which you're playing these pieces specifically really affects how the listener perceives them. And so to be in that like acoustically rich space with such an amazing pianist playing these beautiful pieces.
Right.
Yeah, it was a very formative experience.
Yeah, no, that's definitely like an inspiring thing, and to have that sort of as early on in your career as you did. It's like I understand why Debussy would be one of your favorites. Right. To have a performance like that too. Right. I think that the performances that you perceive, those will like make or break your pieces. Yes. So from or your perception of a piece, I should say, as a composer, right? It's like finding a performer. Like I cannot tell you how many times I've been in like a festival setting where it's like this piece clearly is not for this performer, or like or like having a poorly written piece, let's say, coming to life, you know,
That's
and
so
like it's like, man, this performer, like they really put in a lot of work for
yeah.
this, you know. So I, you know, those are like really important experiences. You know, my first experience with Debussy was from, I think, Ocean's 11. There's this scene at the very end. Yeah, I know, right? It's embarrassing, but it's that scene at the end where they're all, they the job is done, right? And that fountain is going on, and they're playing Claire de Lune in the background. And I had never heard this
Oh
before.
yeah.
So this was my first experience, not only with Debussy, just impressionism in general. Actually, was that piece of music, that
Well, that's
scene.
a great piece too, and I mean it's like used a lot to create atmosphere, right, in movie scenes, and I think that's like an important aspect of Debussy. Like his music really creates a sound world.
Right, it's really
That
atmospheric.
about Mozart or Beethoven or even Chopin. Like Debussy's music is its whole other like.
Right. I mean, it's clearly it's very different, you know,
Yeah.
because I don't know, so much about it. I just get this like glassy sense of it's like everything is real shimmery, you know,
Yeah.
and it just has this like fog over the music.
Right.
It's bizarre. But
There's
then like
another composer though, like soon after or around the same time as Debussy, that like after I was really into Debussy,
mhm.
I fell in love with, and it's still I'm in love with this other composer called Scriabin. And Scriabin, if you asked me today who my favorite like common practice era composer is, I would say hands down
Scriabin. Yeah, his music is bizarre. Well, not bizarre. It's wild, you know.
And he's written 9 or 10 sonatas, piano sonatas, and I've played only the 4th one, and I'm currently learning the 3rd. But there's such a change in his style from the first to last. I mean, it's just completely different. And
I don't know.
It's so cool to see like the way a composer evolves. Like like we talked about with Beethoven, like his early stuff and what his late stuff ended up being.
Yeah. So I don't know all of Scriabin's catalog. I've heard about a handful of pieces from him. But there are a lot of jazz pianists, or there is one in particular in this town who is like really into Scriabin.
Yes, and I would definitely say like Scriabin sounds jazzy, you know?
Yeah.
Just like these chords that have a lot of extensions on them, basically.
Right. He keeps adding more notes to all the chords. But
such a satisfying experience to play. So
I bet. I think so. One of the things I think is really interesting about Scriabin is that he had synesthesia, right? So he would perceive colors and sounds at the same time, or like sounds as colors. And like this clearly had an effect on the way that he would perceive harmony, because it's like not only is he hearing these just thick, luscious chords, right, but he's also seeing like this, this invisible color, this image in front of him, and like he's both painting and composing at the same time. It's so fascinating. Yeah, sorry. So to get a little, I guess, farther into this like modernist sort of view, Debussy sort of, I feel like, really represents this French ideal of music. It's very pretty, it's very luscious, it's this extremely enjoyable thing, and then sort of contrast that with like the other side of the Rhine River, right?
The German,
this sort of German art music that's like being created, specifically from what we can call the Second Viennese School. Now, the very first talk we had, you actually mentioned this, the first Viennese School, which is Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven, right? And these composers sort of create what all the classicists, like what we perceive as classical music, and set up everything for the Romantics, essentially. And then sort of, again, what you said about how at a certain point, composers and artists, they just destroy all the rules, not even new rules, right? Just destroy everything and then rebuild from that, right? And the Second Viennese School, this was exactly their goal, right? To do away with all what had sort of previously existed. Now, that is sort of fudging a little of their intentional, a little bit, right? Because as we said before, Schoenberg was like a classicist kind of through and through, right?
Yeah, actually, I mean, I think the whole Second Viennese school can also be considered to be like a reaction to some of that French romantic lushness that he saw as
Right.
being too sentimental, you know?
Yeah.
And so he wanted to go back to the roots of form. And
Right. Right.
I mean, he's a theorist, I think, more than, anything. You can just see that so strongly in his music.
I agree. I think Schoenberg more so than his students.
Yeah.
He definitely. I feel like he was more, maybe even to his detriment. He was more bound by the rules than I think his students were.
Yeah.
And I mean, I say to his detriment because I mean, quite honestly, like, this is my opinion. Sorry for anybody that gets offended by this. Like, I cannot stand Schoenberg's music.
I don't love playing it either.
Yeah.
So, good company.
Oh, sorry. I once heard. So my teacher told me this story one time about how he once heard Martin Bresnik just talk a ton of trash about Schoenberg's music, like in class.
Oh God.
And like basically it came down to like Schoenberg's music was like cold eggs on a plate. It's just this object that's unappealing, and it is,
Yeah.
And like to me,
Yeah, I kind of think that Schoenberg is important more for what he creates, his legacy,
I agree.
than literally the pieces of music that he created.
I agree. I feel like Schoenberg was much more of a theorist than a composer, which is, I mean, he had an extremely good career considering, kind of where, like, what he lived through and like how he sort of came to be, he's a self-taught violinist, just read a bunch of music books on theory, studied a ton of Mozart and Beethoven, got out of Germany right before World War II, and was just kind of like making music that he wanted to make,
Yeah.
I think also too, it's really like okay, so his students I feel like were way more interesting composers. I actually really love Berg's music. I don't know if you know much about Berg.
I think that's partly because his harmonic language is less bound to the rules of Schoenberg.
Yeah, right.
Berg's piano sonata is, I mean, it's just stunning,
Yeah.
So Webern is the third person in this like little trio of Second Viennese school, and he is very pointillistic, we say, right? Like,
right.
Just like these single notes, and he condensed everything, which is I think the strangest, most unique thing about him. Like, he has pieces that are just a few measures long. Like, I played these pieces for cello and piano a few months ago, and each one was less than a page, which is just so odd, but he was so he wanted to reduce or boil down everything to its most essential form, which is kind of coming back to what I said earlier about like removing the fluff and the sentiment out of it.
Deconstructing everything.
Yes. So he was like, this is perfect with these 6 notes. And so I will end the piece here.
Right. It's like 6 notes. Okay, we're done. Next piece, That's funny. It kind of, I don't know if you ever listened to this group called Tenacious D. Have you ever heard of them before?
I've heard of them. I don't think I've ever listened to.
They have this, it's Jack Black, they have this one song where they're talking about writing songs, right? And he literally just like plays a note and like says, great, done, next song. Like, right?
It's that concept, right? It's like, it's so perfect as it is. Why add anything?
Right. It's everything else is just completely unnecessary. It's like, it's extremely Unitarian, utilitarian. That's the word I'm looking for. Yeah. Utilitarian. But it boils down to its most basic elements. It's like, here is a note, here is rhythm, here's like, it's like pitch, rhythm, color,
right?
And like, that's it. Great.
Right. I think where before, sometimes rhythm served pitch and pitch served color, and you had this hierarchy. Now these composers, I mean, we'll talk about serialism, I'm sure, but the idea that all of these 3 are equally important, and I can manipulate form, rhythm, pitch, articulation, even like whether I play a note short or long. And all of those are extremely important to what I want the piece to be. Whereas before it was kind of left up to the performer how short or long or how loud or soft. Whereas now it's almost like this mathematical science.
Yeah, right. To use the term math, yes, it very much is. Especially like the sort of later years of Schoenberg's
Well,
thinking. Yeah, right. Uh, and then that sort of leads to these like what did they call themselves? To- Total serialists, the total serialist music.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's when they start manipulating
like
not
everything.
but yeah, everything.
Yeah,
Right.
right. So it is, I think, safe to say that music gets a little weird for a while, and that it's almost like things become interesting more for like the performer than like the audience. There seems to be like in like the 40s and 50s, there's this like huge disconnect between what art music is and what
Yeah.
popular music is.
Right. It's like the art music, like who is it for? Is it for the composer and the performer to
Yeah, right,
self-actualize, or is it for the audience to
right. Because I mean, these pieces like they're hyper technical. They had to have been extremely hard to write, and they are extremely difficult to perform. Uh, Nearly every sort of score that I've seen that's like a serialist score or an atonal score, it's like the music is just hyper complex, and
yeah.
to as a performer to even like begin interpreting that, like I don't even know where to start.
Right. It's very painstaking work.
Yeah, you have to devote a lot of time.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine like premiering works like that. It's like
Right, because it's
that's
not even
hard.
like you have any previous performance to go off on.
Right. A lot of it is just up to the performer at that point, but there's so much control that's still in the composer's hands,
Right.
Which I think is an interesting like contrast to the music of like John Cage and these American experimentalists. Uh,
Right.
it seems that like the European composers were like the French were bound by like color and like sound, I feel like, whereas the Germans seem to be bound by like the rules, and like it's like this process,
Yeah.
right? Whereas the American composers are this weird mixture of both of those in the sense that they're experimenting with things just to see like if it works, and if it didn't work, they were like, okay, cool, next thing, right? Uh, there's a lot. It seems that there's just a lot of trial and error with the American composers, like specifically Ives and Cowell and Cage. Uh,
Yeah.
do you have any experience with any of these?
I've actually played some vocal music off Ives, and
Yeah.
um and that's an interesting thing because the influences are different, right? Because yes, they're influenced by the German, ideas of like form and structure and like stretching the harmonic and tonal boundaries, but
Mhm.
also they're trying to bring this very like Appalachia American
Yeah.
nationalism to their songs. And so even though the songs, like if you listen to them, they sound a little weird. They're not there's just something that feels to the average listener, it sounds like something's just off. But if you
Right.
look at the text, it's all text from like folk songs. And some of the like harmonic influences are from folk songs. It's very like middle America, like rural, that kind of life that this flavor they're trying to capture in their songs.
Yeah. The sort of American sound is that wide open spaces kind of
Yes.
thing,
Yeah.
Uh, I
Or like Poland, for example, also like following German practices of structure and form, but like totally different harmonic flavor.
exactly right, and you know, there's this weird like concept. I feel like that was a byproduct of the 20th century as a whole. It's almost like the notes that you played didn't matter, right? It was like how were you actually using them, right? That's
Yeah.
really what seemed to be the draw of music at that time.
Well, I think another important aspect to consider is this like growing sense of nationalism that's happening across most of the world. I mean, we talked about how these American composers, were trying to create their American flavor.
Mm-hmm.
And then you had like maybe a little earlier, like end romantic going into modern, like composers like Grieg, you know, who's trying to get that like Scandinavian, like Norwegian flavor.
Right.
And then you have the Russian composers like Prokofiev and Rachmaninoff and
Right.
Mussorgsky, who are trying to create their own Russian sound, you know, a lot. And
Stravinsky,
then
you know?
eventually Stravinsky was Rite of Spring, yeah.
Mm.
So that's another thing that's like,
Right.
I almost feel like so much of the 20th century is devoted to shaping each individual identity of composers and nations, you know?
Right, right. Which, I mean, this definitely leads to some hairy things, you could say, mid 20th century.
Yeah.
You know, so one of the most interesting things I think about this whole era is that the modernists, like, they were basically writing about what they saw, you know, what the world was around them.
Yeah.
And for like Ives and Cowell, this is this sort of post Civil War reconstruction kind of era, you know. And for like, I don't think Debussy lived through World War I. I can't quite remember, but for like sort of later composers, you know, World War I happens, and this essentially just burns down Europe, right? So like this, they just see like death and destruction, and then like it's not much longer after that World War II happens, and like the same thing, Europe burns down again, right? And this time it seemed like World War II was definitely way more of a powder keg, I guess, than World War I. Like World War I was just empires like, well, we're bored, kind of. Whereas like World War II, it seemed this sort of nationalist identity really came to like a boiling point, you know?
And there was such a strong reaction after that because, you know, composers, artists, and intellectuals realized that this came from this nationalistic fervor. And then we have like Dadaism, you know, which is another movement that's the movement I would say like is quintessentially throw out all the rules, because the structures that have built up that have led us to this point, they all suck. And so we're going to go with nonsense music and nonsense syllables now.
Man, so Dadaism is a really interesting concept, I think. This the famous urinal, right? It's like this is art.
Music, yeah.
Right. Yeah. You know, so one of the coolest things to come out of that movement, I think, is this poem called I think it's the Sonata. Are you familiar with this? The Sonata? Something like that.
So, yeah.
But it's this like multi-movement epic poem of just nonsense syllables, right? But it has form and there's structure to the whole thing.
Yeah.
It's absolutely amazing. But so these art ideas, right? They're not entirely like nonsense, you know. They're not entirely like turning away.
I don't think it's possible for art to exist as perfectly out of context, you know.
Right.
It's always responding by virtue of responding to something. It is given a context.
Right. And so I feel like a lot of American composers start to ask that question of like, you know, what is the context of this music?
Yeah.
So we start to see people like John Cage and like Lamont Young and a little bit later like Frank Zappa, and they start to just do these bizarre things with music.
Right. And speaking of like questioning the context, you have like Cage's 4 minutes 33 seconds, right, where he's like, well, have you ever thought about what the sound base upon which the music is built? So let's create a piece that's 4 minutes and 33 seconds long, where any performer can go on stage and just stand silently, and the audience is forced to listen to the surrounding sound, like the ambient noise. Right?
Well, so it's not just that. It's like that. So I think that is one of the most important pieces of the 20th century for several reasons. First off, it completely breaks down the ego of the composer, right? They have no control over that piece at all, right? It breaks down the ego of the performer. They too have no control over that piece, right?
Very stressful to go up on stage and just sit there or just stand there looking at the audience.
Right. And at the same time, it's like that's a stressful moment for the audience as well, because it's like, how do we respond to this, right? But not only that, it's like now you are forcing the audience to become part of the performance, you know?
Breaking the fourth wall.
Yeah, right. It's like that piece is so important for so many reasons. Man, is it art? Is it music? Like, is it both? Like, what is it? You know, and that seems to be a big part of what the 20th century like asked about art. It's like, well, what is the purpose of this? Like
Yeah.
this thing, you know? We can all
Yeah.
like we all understand what it is, right? It's but or I mean, do we? You know, we understand the concept of what it is, what it's supposed to be, but like, do we really understand it? And like, what is it actually that we're
Yeah.
trying to understand? You know, there's so many things that kind of come out of this. You know, um, clearly this is my favorite era of music. uh,
Composer then makes sense.
yeah, I know, right? Well, nothing's wrong. I can always be right. Okay, great. Oh man. So okay. Um, you know, we've talked about like a wide range of just style and whatnot. Well, I think one of something that's really important to hit on here also is what the Russians kind of went through here as well. Because again, like World War II happens and like literally the world just changes. Everything about the world just changes, and it seems to be that the Western side of the wall, basically, they really pushed forward this idea of progressive art, of pushing art towards its limits, and trying to just really challenge not just the artist but like the audience as well. You know,
Mhm.
whereas on the Eastern side of the wall, that doesn't seem to happen nearly as much, right? It seems to be much more music of the people, right? Ways for the because you know it's this state sponsored thing, and the people
Yeah.
have to
Yeah.
be able to rally
And
around this.
the composers in the Soviet Union at the time were, they were told what to write. So like composers like Prokofiev and Tchaikovsky and all of those guys, they were,
Shostakovich, especially, man.
Shostakovich, yeah, he's the quintessential like told by the government,
Right, like
Um,
literally by penalty of death, you will write
yeah.
this music.
And so that's the reason why a lot of them eventually, they migrate over to the US. But so it's like their output is not even entirely their own, right? Because it's so like they couldn't be honest about how they were feeling and like respond honestly to what they saw around them.
Right,
It's very shaped by the state. Yeah.
right. It's which I mean, in a weird way though, it sort of speaks to the talent of them as like, or maybe not the talent, but just it
Ingenuity, yeah.
yeah, right. Just the way that they were able to sort of like go around this like
Yeah.
state mandate to still create interesting progressive art music,
Right.
Especially with Shostakovich. You know, what is it? The I can't remember. He wrote an opera, and the state basically threatened his family after that because it was like it was not something
There's
the
a
Macbeth or
symphony.
something.
I feel like there's a symphony also where
Oh yeah,
that like people still can't decide if it's like a sarcastic like celebration of.
right. I think it's the Fifth Symphony. I
Yeah,
think.
I'm so bad
It's
at like.
it's the one with the circus theme, or the one that sounds like a circus. You know, that's the one that
Sure.
I don't know. I always like associate it with a circus. It's
Yeah.
funny, but yeah, his music. It's like it's just it's Soviet realism, right? Which is
Right.
just that whole I don't know Soviet realism, right? It's just this weird, bizarre idea of what it's supposed to be.
And it's like interesting because it makes me think about why music sometimes can be more powerful than
Exactly.
like words, because if you think about like the situation in which they're writing, if the Soviet Union is telling you to write this like celebratory symphony, right? And then you write a celebratory symphony, right? There are like certain aspects of music that we can say definitively sound like a celebration.
Right.
But then when a person in the audience who's listening to it is surrounded by all the turmoil of the Soviet Union, what does it become?
Right.
It's such a fascinating thing when like art interacts with context to create something that's totally different than what maybe anyone was intending.
Yeah, I know. You know, so Schoenberg once famously says that like you need to be constricted by the rules. I can't remember exactly how the quote goes, but he basically says you need to be constricted by some kind of rule, right? Something about it breeding the best kind of art or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting because like the Soviet composers, it's like they arguably write some of the best music of the 20th century, you know, but it's like they are literally bound by like the rule.
So many rules, right?
Yeah. It's just, I don't know, it's really interesting that what comes out of that whole era, just in general, and like it just bleeds over into this sort of like postmodernist idea of like do all the things, you know.
And then
like,
when Stravinsky like goes to Paris and starts writing his music there, and we have like like it's no surprise that he wanted to just like shake everything up with that, you know, where people like where there was literally a riot at the premiere.
Yeah, right. We can't not talk about this, right? So I guess Stravinsky is one of my favorite composers, and so everyone knows him for The Rite of Spring, basically. But he wrote a ton of music before that, and it's not The Rite of Spring, and it's beautiful, like Petrushka and The Firebird. So Stravinsky famously wrote these 3 ballets, right? I can't remember if he wrote any more after that, but I know he writes 3 ballets.
Quite a bit because he was like the composer in residence for the Ballet Russe.
Yeah, that's right. I don't remember when he wins that position, but like he's really involved in the Parisian art world. And part of it too is like the Parisians saw him as this really exotic composer, right? Because he was the exotic Russian. So he used a ton of Russian folklore and Russian folk song in his music, and like the Paris people could not get enough of this, and so like he just keeps doing it more and more and more until The Rite of Spring. Like Petrushka and The Firebird are 2 of the most beautiful pieces you can ever listen to, you know. And speaking of just different types of isms, right? This is sort of the beginnings of like this sort of pan-diatonicism. It's like there is no like key, right? And it's just these chords that fit and these harmonies that work together, you know. And I mean, Debussy was kind of struggling, or not struggling through this, but like building this as well, you know. And I definitely
like he was still kind of working within a key, you know, but he didn't.
Right, there was
taking chords out of context, but then Stravinsky takes it even further.
Right. But yeah, I mean, these two ballets are just beautiful, beautiful music. And then like The Rite of Spring happens, and it's just like, what just happened? I have this.
The story of The Rite of Spring is just like.
I know, right? Okay, so this was actually the first viral campaign, like the first viral campaign ever, because I love telling this, man. So Stravinsky, he's known for writing this beautiful ballet music, right? And I can never remember the choreographer's name at the top of my head. Is it
Sergei
Diaghilev?
Sergei Diaghilev, yeah.
Yeah. Diaghilev, he was the ballet. Forgetting the word now. He would coordinate the dance.
Yeah.
What's the word? Whatever. He was the dance guy, right? Yeah. So Stravinsky wrote their music, and Diaghilev like did the dance stuff, and choreographed. That's it. Diaghilev choreographed, and so he commissions basically. Commissions I keep wanting to say Shostakovich, Stravinsky to write this piece of music, right? And like the material they were working with was so shocking for that time to begin with, right? Because the opera itself was about this, the ballet was about this primitive tribe, right? And they are essentially making a virgin sacrifice to the nature gods for, you know, a bountiful harvest. Right, it's the rite of spring, right? You got to make a sacrifice to make spring come about, right? Primitive thought. So Stravinsky starts to write this just ridiculous music. It was music that no one had ever heard before. It's highly, highly rhythmic, right? In the midst of all the production of this, right, when they're rehearsing it, when they're putting everything together, Diaghilev and Stravinsky both write anonymously to the local newspapers about how terrible the show's going to be. It's going to be the worst thing ever. None of it makes sense. You will be better off by never seeing this show in your life. Ban the show, right? ban it before it even comes out. You know, and it's like, well, clearly this is going to make the Parisians want to go see the show, you know?
I want to see the train wreck.
Right, yeah, exactly. And like they built up so much fervor for this show that on the opening night, like the Parisian audiences rioted in this theater. Like they nearly burned the theater down. It's crazy from the very first note. Now, I think it's hilarious because Stravinsky will like famously go like he went to his deathbed saying that it was because the music he wrote that this sparked this like riot. But like truly it was because I think like what they were depicting on stage, the fervor they had built up on it, and just the wild sounds that Stravinsky was creating all combined together. Like
Yeah.
they couldn't handle it, man. They could not handle it.
Yeah, I think that's the beginning of like the rhythm, the obsession with rhythm that
Yeah, right.
happens in the 20th century more than any other time.
Yeah. Stravinsky also was like really into jazz. He loved the idea of jazz and pop music, essentially, right?
Yeah.
It was just, and I mean, if you deconstruct jazz far enough, it's essentially just Western harmony with like Cuban, Afro-Cuban rhythms.
Yeah.
And like,
right.
it's just the fusion of these two things, you know? So rhythm takes a whole new importance for these small like
Yes.
groups. There's a really funny story I think between Stravinsky and Charlie Parker. Like Charlie Parker is this just amazing jazz saxophonist, right? And he loved the music of Stravinsky. He absolutely loved it. So Charlie Parker in a nutshell, like quintessential sort of like live fast, die hard kind of thing. Live hard, die fast, maybe. And like he sort of, I think he died when he was like in his like late 30s or early 40s, but he'd done so many drugs that the coroners like thought that he was a 60-year-old man, right? This guy was like a rock star for his time. He was also the reason that like jazz saxophone is jazz saxophone today. You know?
Yeah,
Like,
he's
why
just a virtuoso. He was called the bird. Yeah.
Right, he was the bird because he just floated above everybody else, you know. So there's one performance like in New York one time that Stravinsky's there and Charlie Parker is playing at this club, and Charlie Parker loved Stravinsky's music. He loved The Rite of Spring, right? He knew that bassoon, the opening sort of bassoon solo, and this is the bassoon solo for everyone that's listening that sparked the riot at the Rite of Spring, right? So Stravinsky walks into this club, Charlie Parker sees him, and Charlie Parker turns to his band and he's like, "Hey guys, we have to start playing this one tune," right? I can't remember the exact tune. It was some famous jazz standard, right? And so they start playing, and in like the first chorus of his solo, he starts to play the bassoon lick for the Rite of Spring, right?
Nice.
He plays the entire thing, you know, and it made no sense with like what's happening. Like, he couldn't have made any sense with what was happening.
Sure.
But like Stravinsky sort of hears this and he's like sitting in this cafe and he just bursts into tears because he's like so moved that the great Charlie Parker was playing my music, you know?
Right.
And like, you know, this is like the first time they meet, I think, and like they sort of spark up this friendship after that.
That's so cool.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's because of Stravinsky actually that Parker starts to get into the sort of upper echelon circles of New York, you know? And Stravinsky really is a big part of why jazz became like an art form, because he was one of the first guys to like respect it in a way, you know?
Because if you think about the origins of jazz, and you know, it's diametrically like at that time would have been considered so far from classical music, but then like starting then there's this fusion happening. Like even Ravel is like very influenced by jazz harmonies.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you know, something I find really interesting is also like Berg is going back to the second Viennese school, right? Berg also, he's much more than like anybody else in that sort of sound world. Berg is using a lot of sort of these dominant seventh sounds or just jazzy sounds, essentially.
Yeah.
A lot of harmonies that were drawn from jazz.
Right.
And like he's making this sort of like highly intense art music out of these what were considered sort of common sounds at this time, you know? And this idea of jazz really takes a hold of the late modernists and like the postmodernists that sort of come after them. And conversely, like all of these postmodern and modernist ideas really take a hold in jazz, and a lot of modernist ideas have been starting to pop up a lot lately. Jazz has become extremely deconstructive as of late. Like people are
Yeah.
just like breaking it down to its most basic of
Yeah.
things. It's really cool.
Yeah.
uh, so okay, final thoughts. What do you got about modern music?
Oh, I mean, there's so much we haven't even touched on. Like
I know.
as a pianist today, like I consider myself as being like very into contemporary music, but I have never played a piece by Schoenberg, you know? And
Mm,
so like it's this interesting thing where like yes, Schoenberg is contemporary, but he's not really contemporary, right? I mean, he's starting this era and we tend to lump everyone from Schoenberg on into like
right.
contemporary, but then we have this other issue of like living composers like yourself.
Yeah.
Nowadays, like there are so many changes that are happening and so much evolution in music and in sound and new music as we call it, right?
Mhm.
And
It's
so it's just the for me like it's important to prioritize playing music that's written in the time that I'm familiar with, right? Because
mm,
it's written in response to what I see around me and what I know. And for me, that's so much more compelling than playing a prelude by Schoenberg. And
yeah.
like, I love Steve Reich, for example. Like, I've played
Mm.
so much Steve Reich, like ensemble stuff. And I think it's so fun, like minimalist music, which we didn't really talk about, but is
Yeah,
very
right.
important because minimalist music was this like genre that started within classical, but then really heavily influenced like pop music, trance music, electronic music, like
Yeah,
all
right.
that's
All the minimalists, they were highly influenced by the pop music of the time, you
and
know?
like Steve Reich studied like West African drumming for
Right.
many years. And so I think it's for me all that kind of multicultural and you know all these influences that characterize music starting in like 1970 1980 when there was such free and quick exchange of information across the world,
Mhm.
that's what makes contemporary music new music so exciting,
Yeah,
you
right.
know.
I totally understand. I think it's really cool. Like today, you know, today making music is so accessible, you know, because like there, it's so easy to just create a score, for instance, you
Right.
know. You go into your notation software or spit out the MIDI data into this thing, you know, and to be able to give that to a performer and they can interpret this, you know, it's just it's so amazing how quickly these things can be created now.
Yeah, and how
You know,
quickly it can be shared.
right, right,
Well,
right.
once you perform a piece it's like on the internet and anyone can see it, which
Right.
is cool and a little bit scary, but
Yeah, I know, right? It's a modern day printing press,
yeah,
man. Like
right,
everyone becomes a publisher of their own content, you know.
right,
It's like it's amazing because you know these composers in like the classical era, you know, the sort of 18th century, they're writing all this stuff by hand, you know. They have mistakes, they scratch it out, they start over, and like you do this until it's ready to be published, right? And then you hand it to the
then
publisher.
have like a first edition, second edition where they make
Yeah,
based on mistakes that happened in the first one. And
right. And to think that like even going through that process, composers like Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven, they like they still wrote this enormous amount of music, even going through this grueling process of doing it, right? And then to see it's like it wasn't that much different for the Romantics. It's like they're still writing music the same way. They're still creating all of this work for them. I mean,
right,
they have to, you know, to in order to create it. Uh, and in a way, it's like even in the early 20th century, there still wasn't like much much difference for these composers. They
right,
still had to sit down with pen and paper and like write this stuff out, you know. And in like the 80s and 90s, man, like with the tech, like the advent of technology, the advent of like just accessible MIDI software
yes,
and
yes,
just all these like DAWs and just the internet, you know, and the ability to share all of these things and just to create to be able to create art now is so much more accessible. It's unreal. Uh,
so cool. I mean, you can have it like anyone can produce it and you can have these gems that come out of nowhere from someone
yeah,
who like 30 or 40 years ago wouldn't have had access, and that's what's so cool about making music today. And like and a good shift that's like now starting to happen in classical music, right? That it's not just like people with more privilege or access who are able to make music.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's a very important thing too. And like, there's so many more ways to access this art now. You know, and to be able to be able to access this art from like the Baroque era, that was its sole purpose was to like just make you feel transcendent, you know, or like to lift you out of your mundane life, you know, and to just be able to absorb that, right? And it doesn't matter like who you are either. That's the best part about it. And the I've always thought this is really, really interesting, like those sort of like found instrument orchestras and stuff. I'm trying to remember. There's one in, was it Brazil? I think it's Brazil. They essentially like built all their own instruments, and like they created an orchestra, right? Like a classical orchestra out of these sort of like instruments that they were able to build themselves, you know? Yeah. And then they started to play them, and they started to like create an actual ensemble out of these things, you know? And like, I don't know, it might seem kind of gimmicky, but it's like, that's a really important thing too, because it, you know, this sort of like this want to do this, you know? These artistic ideas, man, they truly do, like, I feel like they make you a better person, you know, to be able to connect with something on an emotional level. It's like, it truly does make you perceive your, like, this world differently, you know?
Well, I think it's what, at the most basic level, it's what makes us human, right? Like language and like symbolic meaning is what sets us apart from any other animal species.
Right.
Well, the fact that our brain has capacity to do that. So if, you know, I don't think it's a complete existence if you're not engaging with art. And it's so sad that some people don't have that luxury.
Yeah.
I understand. I think about like all of the people who are like stuck at home during this quarantine, right? What are they doing? Like for a lot of the day, they're engaging with artistic creations, movies, music, books, like all that kind of stuff, you know?
Right. Which brings up an interesting question. It's like, is there a line between art and media?
I mean, I think these forms of media are kinds of art. Like a movie can be art.
Yeah,
you know?
Right. Yeah. I wonder at what point does like the consumption of it sort of cheapen the value of it, you know?
I mean, well, I think watching like 7 episodes of Tiger King in one day is probably not consuming art, you know, but...
Fair enough. I have yet to watch that show, actually. I've been
a couple days ago.
Did you watch 7 episodes of it?
Oh no, I've done 5 so far.
Oh, okay, good. In one sitting, right?
I would say it is definitely not art. It is, it's good though.
Right. Well, I mean, the Dadaist would say it's art, right?
I don't know about that. I feel like Dadaism art was just, you know, lack of context. I don't think this is, I think art comes also, it's with the intention of creating it, right? Like you can't say something is art unless the person who created it wanted it to be some kind of art. So I don't think I guess that would be the difference then between.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
That makes sense. I don't know, man. Media is funny. Anyway, cool. That's all I really got, man. We're just like talking at this point. Class, thank you for listening as far as you've gotten.